The beer game was introduced half a century ago to familiarize students with the sort of oddities that are found in supply chain. And more specifically, with the beer game, people can actually experience what it is to run a supply chain when there are multiple parties involved who do not have access to perfect information, and the sort of distortion that you get, especially in the perception of the actual customer demand. So today, I am pleased to be joined by Jes Bengtsson, who has actually been playing the real beer game in the real world for over a decade at scale in Europe with some leading beer companies. So yes, thank you very much for being there. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and what you're doing presently?
Thanks, Joannes. Yes, I definitely can. The beer aspect of it, I worked for breweries, S&op Miller, which was the second largest brewer in the world at the time, migrating through AB InBev through a takeover, and then ultimately being sold off in the European division and joined as part of that Asahi Breweries, which bought the European function. And in that, I've had nearly all functions across supply chain, but most of the time spent within planning in that. And currently, I am an expert with McKinsey and Company.
And for the audience, I believe that the problem illustrated by the beer game, you know, the fictitious the fictitious thing, not the real world company, is the bullwhip. But I believe that this sort of aspect is actually fairly real, and in particular, there exists some kind of asymmetry of information between what is happening with people consuming beers and people who have actually to fulfill the requirements of actually producing the beers in I would say, that are remote, a step, one or several steps remote from the actual end consumers. Can you maybe shed some light, I would say, on this specific industry?
Yes. So the curious fact about the origin of the beer game and why it's called the beer game and not the tomato game is that under American legislation, the breweries are not allowed to trade directly with stores. There must be a distributor in the middle, and hence it was exactly the setup that you're looking for, that says you're passing through several layers of supply chain in order to get from your customer to that end. So it's actually not because it's sort of inherently anything specific about beer. It's a very generic thing that you see in all supply chains. It fits well in an American supply chain because then you get the tiers of it. But it's absolutely true that the effect exists in supply chain. You have consumers, and then you have several layers where the main signal that is present at every level is what orders do I receive from my customer or from my customers. So the person drinking the beer will go and buy it at a shop. The shop will then reach out to their distributor. The distributor will reach out to the brewery. And all of that happens with delays and with their own ordering rules. So you both got inventory effects, you got ordering rules and roles, and you've got the inability to respond quickly. And all of that drives, that says by the time that a message arrives at the brewery that a beer has just been consumed, it can end up being quite distorted along the way.
And this type of supply chain is actually quite challenging because, I mean, beer is relatively affordable. So it is something that is not sold with very, very high margins. It is also fairly heavy. I mean, it's a liquid, and so I'm all the steps, transportation, etc. All of that weighs a lot in this sort of supply chain. Could you tell us a little bit more about the main specificities of I would say the beer supply chain, and what has the most economic impact on making, I would say, a good beer supply chain versus a relatively inefficient one?
Yes. So if we start with the first one that says how is beer different from other industries, there are two main things that make it quite specific. One is exactly the one that you talk about. The value density of the beer product is very low, so the amount of euros that you can fit on a pallet, and therefore where other industries talk about sort of what's the size of your inventory coverage, it's nearly always just a financial metric. In the beer world, it's literally a matter of, if I add a week of cover, I need to go out and find 2 new warehouses because it's so voluminous in order to fit. That also then drives, that says you can't run a supply chain where distribution is an afterthought. All beer supply chains are heavily impacted by the fact that says if you drive your beer too far, you've just wasted your entire margin, and hence being close to where demand is a very relevant cost driver. And hence, if you sort of loop that into the planning side of things, you also can't do the classical that says, let me first do production planning and then I do distribution planning afterwards. You need, at least if you want to do it well, you need a joined up plan that says, okay, what are all my plants that are capable of doing this? Where's all my demand? How does that fit so that I get the lowest total cost while meeting all the demand out of typically a network of multiple breweries, multiple plants that are able to do the same thing.
And as an end consumer, I noticed that beers, like many other, I would say, similar products in supermarkets, are being promoted, which creates a challenge of I imagine, dealing with a supply chain where I will observe, fluctuations caused by those promotions, while, as you were describing, it is already a challenge to maintain all the margins and have, I would say, warehouses and capacities that are properly sized. How does it play out with promotions and the sort of I would say, artificial fluctuation that are introduced, yes, I would say, on the, by the distributors themselves, or at least at the level of the distributors, yes, themselves?
So promotions can have a heavy impact on the rate of sale, because you have a relatively constant demand, and what you mainly see is shift between what is the product that is being sold. It is, depending on the country, there are a few categories in a supermarket that can drive footfall. So in the Nordics and other dairy loving countries, fresh milk is one of those categories. Diapers tend always to be in that category, and then beer for especially heavy beer traditional countries. So that's a clear way for supermarkets that says, I want the footfall in my store, and they will be happily cost leading on whatever category drives that right now. And beer is one of that, and that clearly shifts both demand from store to store and from brand to brand. And of course, if you're not on top of what is about to happen, then you'll be sold out very, very quickly. If a major supermarket chain does something, they tend to be in understanding with the breweries when that has happened. It tends to be planned depending on the market dynamics. Some are more mature than others. There are some sort of cowboy, wildcat type campaigns happening or discounting, and that can be problematic, because then you're essentially not getting the full value of it, because then you start a campaign, and halfway into the campaign, then there's no more beer because no one knew that it was coming. But then back to the planning challenge. One of the challenges is then sort of what mechanics of a campaign will drive what type of demand response. And that's not obvious, because there are many parameters that says, do you do a sort of a 3 for 2 that'll drive sort of very, very beer consuming, versus I do a reduction just on every bottle that will drive a different response. Sometimes there's like a sort of a threshold that says, if you meet it here, you'll be driving a ton of sales. If you just lower it a little bit, it'll just be sort of a marginal increase. So it's not a linear curve. And one of the challenges is sort of building up your your corporate history in terms of what are all the campaigns that have been run in the past. Now that I'm doing another one, what do I therefore expect to be the outcome of that one? Because that's the nature of the game. You don't control the demand. You're trying to incentivize demand. You're making a change, and then you're hoping for an effect of a certain magnitude that makes it worth your while to have not got the profit.
And shaping demand is a relatively sophisticated way to approach the market. And in a way, again, from an end consumer, you see the sort of two conflicting image, which would be as the traditional products, where there are many brands that advertise, since middle age, whatever,
yes.
We are doing it that way. And the reality, which is beer is now produced with very modern supply chain. That's the way beer can actually be affordable. And so you've actually spent more than a decade in this industry. What sort of changes have you seen, from your start to your present day? And maybe if you extend further, what sort of, I would say, ongoing changes do you see happening in this industry?
I think one of the core observations is just how little has changed, not since the Middle Ages, but certainly for the last 100 years. If you buy a lager Pilsner style beer today, the brewers of a decade or a century ago would absolutely clearly understand every step that's going on, because they would be doing some of the very same steps. There's certain things that happen at the time simply just because of technological limitations that have been overcome. Like in the past, you couldn't control temperature deep inside a vat of hot liquid, and therefore you had to do some approximation that says, okay, if it's boiling, I know it's 100%, so I'll sort of take a third, and then I'll boil that, and then I'll put it back in, and then I can calculate the average of what's the likely temperature, and you do that until you hit the likely temperature. So there's sort of technological advances that have happened there. But the core principles of the steps of brewing and how long it takes, etc., they actually haven't changed much. The ingredients are the same. What has changed is there are newer categories that says you got flavored beers, you got alcohol pops, you got all sorts of things that you can make out of the same technology base and sell to a wider variety of taste. Beer is an acquired taste. It's not everyone that sort of like the bitterness of the product. With that same acid base, you can essentially make a base alcohol and buy in flavors from a flavor house that targets exactly the flavor profile that you're looking for, and then target that particular niche. So I think one of the key things is that you can have a much wider array of liquids. And of course, the packaging offerings have changed substantially, and breweries are becoming much more adept at sort of capturing specific situations in which a product is consumed, and then matching a product both in terms of the brand, but also sort of is this, if it's a can, then it's typically a convenient one to go out. If it's just for a session at home, then perhaps it's a small one or a big one. So the combination of many more types of liquids, many more types of occasions to drink, many more types of packaging is the main change. And then on the supply chain itself, of course, there's more and more sophistication, and that's what you typically get in a situation where you have sufficient stability that the underlying core hasn't changed that much, and therefore you've had clever people who've now had a couple of decades to think about what is the best use of all the available technology that's available to us, both in terms of making the product, but in terms of planning the product, in terms of distributing it. So a interesting combination of rather old-fashioned and lots of things that you would recognize throughout the century, and some rather new takes.
And what do you see? I mean, again, as the complexity has increased, not I would say on the back end, but more on the front end, especially the packaging, the flavoring, the more SKUs you add, the more complexity you add. But as you were mentioning, also you have the fact that the consumption of beer is overall relatively stable, and thus you end up with many more SKUs. But ultimately, you're going to have a lot of substitution cannibalization. And thus, the way I see that is that as you increase that, you can capture market shares, but also you complicate your own game.
Yes.
By having to micro-tune all those cannibalization and substitution that are happening within your own assortment kind of all the time. How would you, what is your overall analysis on this sort of area, of this part of the challenge, of being able to dynamically adjust the assortment? Is it something that is really done just in time, or are more analytics, I would say more powerful analytics involved? What are the main strategies to cope with this extra complexity?
The complexity of the pricing and the cannibalization tends not to be factored into the demand. You're absolutely right that the dynamic exists, that to a large extent you're not just competing against the competition, you're also competing against yourself, and the finer that you slice your offering, the more interfaces you'll have where it could be this one versus that one. So there's a couple of things in that. There's almost like sort of a fighting in depth analogy from the military that says sort of this is your first line of defense, this is your second line of defense, where to some extent you also need to be clear on what's the success metric that says, do I need to be in store of everything now that I have a very finely tuned array? So if I have the right brand in a can, does it matter too much if I don't have the right brand in the right can in the right size, or in the right sort of 6-pack versus 12-pack? And hence we would qualify that says how well are you performing at the very specific SKU, but equally so that says that what are the things that we believe are substitutable, mostly substitutable in the minds of the consumer. Of course, he has a preference, but inside that one, there's not that much difference over to the next line of defense. And hence, if you're in stock of the group that is relatively interchangeably exchangeable, then you would still be in stock, so to speak, to be able to meet the underlying demand. On the pricing structure, the most dynamic things that tend to happen on pricing. So you have like two tiers. You have like sort of almost like annual price list issuance, and there's a lot of analysis that goes behind that in terms of all the dynamics that you're talking about. What is the cannibalization across? And then you got the shorter term, which tends to be almost exclusively promotion driven. And then, of course, yes, there are learnings inside that one based on that building up a catalog of how did all of those promotions pan out. And one of the key parameters there is sort of how much more did I sell of the one that I intended to sell, and how did that impact the rest.
And now, I mean, going from your looking at your journey, so you've actually started in this industry. You spent more than a decade, and now you've actually transitioned toward McKinsey, a consulting firms. I would say the stereotype, for my own stereotype of, I would say, the McKinsey consultant is a brilliant student coming fresh out of college, and which is a little bit of a paradox, because you end up having someone who may have, I would say, tons of energy, being overall very smart, but is completely inexperienced into helping companies. So here you have your profile where you come with, I would say, a very strong industrial background, a very, I would say, deep experience into one industry. How do you see your own contribution in a company like McKinsey? What do you see the sort of present-day supply chain challenge, where maybe even beyond the specific brewing industry, where your experience can be relevant, and by extension, the sort of contribution of McKinsey can be most relevant?
So one of the things that has surprised me by joining McKinsey is just how vast an array of experts that exist inside that company on the most obscure topics that are available. I now have a place on that very large shelf of experts that you can pluck down from the wall and say, okay, we need someone who knows something very specific about supply chain and distribution for breweries. But of course, that sort of expands in sort of circles around that spot. That says if you can talk about beer, you can probably also talk about certainly other liquids. You can talk about other CPG, and I think that is one of the interesting things for supply chain practitioners is that supply chains are all very, very specific, and in another sense, very, very similar in that you're talking about the same aspects. You have a customer that doesn't want for the time it takes you to make the product, hence you need to forecast in advance. You have a manufacturing facility that's a black box, or at least you can consider it that says you stick in raw materials in one end and magically out the other end comes a product. And whether that is canned tomatoes or beer or rubber tires, you can abstract that away, and you have raw materials that need to be planned, and you have distribution, and all of that you do through people, processes, data systems. So in that aspect, sort of, it's the same toolbox that you apply in different ways to different industries. Of course, knowing what those particular kinks are, you may not know them. If I walk into another brewery that I didn't work at, I wouldn't know exactly what theirs are, but based on my experience there, of course I can sort of say it would be interesting to know how you do X, Y, and Z, because that will sort of tune me into that specific. So deep concentration in one area of expertise and relevance across many others. And on your topic about how does McKinsey help there, I think one of the key things that companies come to with McKinsey is that the C-suite, the top echelons of management of a company, tends to go to McKinsey when they think that they need help with something. And what that can be helped with has traditionally been sort of strategy or finance or M&A. One of the things that's very top of mind at the moment for CEOs is my supply chain hasn't been performing the way that I would like, and hence there's a lot of asks coming also the McKinsey way in terms of how can you help improve the operation, and then having that combination of senior management trust, the ability to take a strategic approach to the problem, while being able to back it up with the actual expertise, and then the engine room of fresh young graduates who have a lot of brains and a lot of energy to go at it, while being guided along the way by senior management and experts, often produces very good results.
And the interesting things that I see is that those certain classes of companies were by necessity very much supply chain driven, like for example breweries, as you mentioned. You can't have your distribution as an afterthought. You really need to think, I would say, holistically, or maybe end to end to really see the full picture, because otherwise even your production apparatus is going to be a misfit, and you won't be able to recover your distribution channels if you don't think the whole picture from day one. But for many companies, they could actually treat supply chain as an afterthought, especially the companies that had the extreme opposite, where on the contrary, the price density was super high, so we can actually move stuff all around the world. That was, let's say, electronics, except when suddenly you realize that those overseas suppliers have trouble of their own, and then depending on on suppliers that are the other side of the world, and that may have suddenly very different priorities compared to you, can be a real challenge for the continuation of your own operations. I think that's a very interesting experience. Do you see, I would say, in this, do you see supply chain reaching out more to, I would say, the sort of higher level of many companies? Because again, my perspective is that except for companies that where supply chain by necessity was really, I would say, a primary concern, like breweries, like plenty of other, I would say, obviously plain commerce where you're just moving stuff around. But for many other companies where it was not that much of a constraint, it was really a second-class citizen. I believe that there are some industries, like for example fashion, that are really coming to terms to the fact that having things the other side of the world is a problem, and you really need to think holistically about that. But what are your take, I would say, about supply chain generally and this relationship between company strategy and supply chain? It's a vast, subject, but
Yes.
if you have one or few takes on that.
No, I think we're seeing a couple of things. I think we're seeing that that you had companies that actually believed that they were quite well on top of their game in terms of how to run supply chain. You had like good service levels, decent inventory levels, the classical parameters that at a cursory look, this looks nice. And what they now realized is that they have a supply chain which was sort of very well tuned to a very specific operating system where you can rely on that tomorrow looks not too different from yesterday. And now they're all of a sudden realizing that we're actually not equipped to deal with good supply chain decisions when everything is not normal. And I think that is a challenge that is coming to the forefront of many that sort of realized that supply chain was important and had sort of over time gradually built something which was good enough for a stable supply chain because they were in a stable environment. And now that they're not, they're realizing that some of the many assumptions that we have almost hard-coded into the way we do things are not working anymore because those assumptions are now broken. And that's not just a flip of a switch because it's a complete mindset in the organization. It's the entire toolkit that you're talking about that sort of simply doesn't exist. And then you have other companies, as you say, that actually sort of never thought that supply chain was something that, I mean, of course, it needs to run, but it can be very much an afterthought because our margins are large enough, and we just like sort of first design the product, and then we say, go and build me this, and don't disturb me, essentially. That are sort of realizing that the amount of damage that it can do to a company if your supply chain doesn't run, even if it has not been considered, even if my margins are fat. If you don't have anything to sell, then you have a fat margin on a very, very low quantity, and then it impacts a lot. So I think those are the two aspects where we're seeing where people are maturing into a view, and that's of course why this is a fascinating time to be a supply chain professional, is that a lot of people are realizing says perhaps we should beef up our skill sets in this area.
Thank you very much for those insights. See you next time.